Welcome to my talk about cause and interpretivism. Now, some interpretivists might suggest that this is an oxymoron, that interpretivism is more concerned with constitution than it is with cause, but as I have argued, many interpretivists, beginning with Max Weber, see causal narratives as the principal source of knowledge about the social world. Interpretivists today start from the assumption that cause is not a feature of the world. The world isn't out there waiting to be discovered and characterized in causal terms. Cause is a concept, sometimes useful, sometimes not, that we invoke in our efforts to make sense of reality with differing degrees of success. The best evidence for this, I think, is the fact that philosophers for now close to 100 years have attempted to come up with a definition of cause that is both logically consistent and applicable to the range of situations that cause seems to be applicable. They failed to do so. Formulation after formulation is shown to be either inconsistent or mostly inapplicable to a whole range of situations. Some philosophers have argued for the notion of singular cause, which is of course Weber's understanding, which is again applicable or acceptable to interpretivists because it suggests that there are many events about which causal stories can be told, but they're sufficiently context dependent that what we learn from these stories won't help us explain or predict other events. At best, they might be starting points in which we look to see the ways in which these other situations are similar or different, leading generally to quite different causal narratives. If this is so, we can suggest that the social world is not only a more difficult nut to crack than the physical world, because we can't generally have controlled experiments that limit the variables that are in place, but that cause may be in some ways a restrictive rather than liberating concept. Consider, for example, the famous story often used about a couple who have candles in their window at Christmas time. They go out to a party. The windows in this old house are not perfectly sealed. As a result, a bit of the breeze from outside, it is a breezy night, gets in, and it blows one of the curtains in the vicinity of the candle. It catches fire. The husband had been meaning to change the batteries in one of the smoke alarms, but put it off and hadn't done so. As a result, there's no electronic signaling that a fire is underway, but rather this depends upon, or discovery depends upon a neighbor seeing the flames and calling the police. By the time they get there, much of the house has been destroyed. What caused the fire? There's no single event, no efficient cause that we can invoke toward this end. Rather, what we have is multiple chains of causation. The weather outside, a breezy night, the invitation of the couple to leave their home so they weren't around to catch it at the fire at the outset. The fact that the curtains weren't fully secured, so could be blown by the breeze in the vicinity of the candles. The absence of a battery, and hence a functioning smoke alarm that might have alerted the police early enough to come and save the house. We have multiple storylines leading to a confluence that was to some degree contingent, and we might argue about how contingent it was. This kind of situation is readily applicable to international relations, and I've made the case, I won't go again into the details today, that World War I was the result of a confluence of this kind, of three quite independent causal chains that came into confluence in 1914. And had that confluence not happened, by the time 1917 came, there were all kinds of reasons why leaders in the three countries that were willing to draw their swords in 1914 at the outset, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Russia, would, rather than being risk accepting, have become risk averse. When we face a situation like this, cause may still be a useful concept, but it has to be reframed. We have to go well beyond the notion of efficient cause, and rather we have to work ourselves back. We have to ask ourselves, well, we can work from either direction. We can ask ourselves, here's the event we're interested in, what appear to be its most immediate causes, and what were the causes of those causes. And we trace this back until we feel that we have a satisfactory account. In doing this, we also have to look at the ways in which these causes are independent of one another. So we might have, as we did in the case of my argument with 1914, multiple causal chains, three of them. To what extent were they related? To what degree were they fully independent? And at what level of analysis would we have to go back to change something, therefore to see how contingent it is? Is it a function of the environment, of agency, or is it deep-seated set of beliefs or institutional structures that would have been more difficult to change? So by creating such a backward causal map, we can both make some judgments about why an event occurred, but also how contingent it was. We can also work the other way. We might start with a putative cause. It may be a very broad one, like modernity, which of course we have to define, or something like a particular intellectual or organizational orientation. Various people have tried to explain World War I and other events, other wars, in terms of a commitment to the offensive rather than the defensive. So if this is so, we start with a cause and we work our way to its effects. But in doing so, we have to ask ourselves, what else was necessary to make these things happen? So in the case, for example, of offensive military orientation, that may have been around for 30 years, but there wasn't a war. So other things had to happen to make that cause meaningful to the situation at hand. Either way, we come up with fairly complicated causal maps. It's more of an art than a science. It's more like playing a game of chess than designing an experiment. We have to think which moves are the most promising, and how, in the case of chess, might an opponent respond. So each of those moves has multiple possible counter moves, and very quickly we ratchet up the number of combinations to such an extent that a computer has a real advantage over a human chess player, which is why they now consistently are able to beat human masters. We don't have an opponent in this sense, but we do have a counterfactual opponent, because if we're saying that something caused it, we have to ask ourselves what would happen if it wasn't there. What if, so to speak, the opponent didn't do that or hadn't done that? So either way, we're engaged in a complicated set of thought experiments that have to be conducted in as rich an evidentiary environment as possible. And here we have to recognize that there isn't that much difference between factual and counterfactual arguments. They both depend on assumptions that are consistent with evidence. There's never, or rarely ever, a smoking gun. In doing this, we construct social science in a very different way than we do something like physics. Rather than thinking of propositions and theories which we prove or disprove, we think of the kinds of knowledge this interpretivist search for causes generates as something that may be more akin to the practice of medicine. So a patient comes into the doctor's office and complains of various symptoms. The doctor says to herself, well, these symptoms are consistent with a range of possible illnesses. I don't know which, but the doctor may have a suspicion. The patient may not look sick enough to be suffering from some of the most serious illnesses associated with these symptoms. Or certain illnesses may be much more common than others and more likely. So a good clinician will attempt, if there are some obvious tests, to rule out or confirm a certain kind of illness. Or she might prescribe a particular kind of medicine and see if that works. If it does, fine. If not, we'll then do more tests to see what else might be the case. As in interpretivist searches for cause, there's a tacking back and forth between evidence and supposition, testing, even counterfactual testing by ruling out a particular possible ailment, and in the end, a picture is put together of the patient and his or her situation. And here too, like interpretivist causal narratives, that particular narrative that fits an individual patient will tell you nothing in particular about the next patient. But again, it's more evidence that can be used as starting points or points of inquiry when examining other causal situations or other patients with particular symptoms bothering them. So what we have is knowledge that ultimately reveals itself as useful in the world, but which must also be established as possible by some degree of very careful empirical analysis. So this is the interpretivist approach to cause. There's one other aspect to it here, that when we go beyond efficient causes, we encounter deeper underlying causes, and they may be the beliefs that actors hold about the world. It could be very narrow beliefs, such as the balance of power is going to change dramatically in the next 5 years against us or in our favor. And this leads us to frame a problem in certain ways and put a particular degree of urgency or not on responding to adversaries. It may relate to values, that honor is more important than security, and certainly for aristocrats in the 19th century, this was the case. They were willing to risk their lives in duels. World War I can be framed as a duel. Hoffner makes a very nice case in support that Franz Josef, who was normally peacefully inclined, this is the aging emperor of Austria-Hungary, saw the assassination as a challenge, and that the empire's honor would be besmirched unless it drew the sword. The German Kaiser viewed it the same way, and in fact, in one of his marginal notes, wrote that his role was to be a second to Franz Ferdinand in his duel with Serbia. So this frame of reference was very relevant. There are, of course, even deeper frames of reference. In an earlier talk, I used a very interesting book by Jens Bartelsen about how the imaginary of the state developed due to changes in cosmological understandings. I've made a related argument about how changes in maps and portraiture created a world in which not only the territorial state became possible in the imagination, but became almost a necessary thing to work toward. So there are these deep frames of reference. They may be visual, they may be in the value world, they may be conceptual, but ultimately they relate to the way people behave, and their behavior in turn is responsible for events once it's aggregated, because there are many people who are behaving at once in political situations. Putting together this kind of picture is complicated, and it may be that scholars examining the same problem can put together many different pictures, all of them equally consistent with the evidence and seemingly compelling. There's nothing wrong with this, in contrast to traditional positivists who see, well, let me reframe this, that traditional positivists also accept that there may be multiple explanations for physical phenomena, but ultimately one will be preferable to the other, either because it's a simpler explanation, in other words, Occam's razor, or because this explanation also allows you to explain other things. And the more things that it can explain, the more preferable it is to an explanation that can only explain the phenomena under study. It's very hard to apply these kinds of tests to interpretivist understandings. To the extent that we judge them in any way, it is in their utility. So in that sense, are they applicable? Do they provide some insights into situations that we confront in the real world? And this we only know, of course, in retrospect. So interpretivist causal narratives, while I think more reflective of the nature of the social world, are also fuzzier, more difficult to assess, often multiple in nature, and can lead one with a certain degree of frustration. these are choices that people make. There are some scholars who are simply more comfortable believing that the world is orderly and amenable to our understanding in abstract terms. There are others of us that see the world as inherently chaotic, as more like a cloud than a clock, to use Karl Popper's comparison, to see the world as disorderly, irregular, and largely unpredictable. If this is so, then these kinds of not fully satisfactory but often very interesting interpretivist causal narratives are more fitting. Thank you.